Okay, let's take a look at what else we can do with materials. So I'm going to switch back to object mode. And so this is kind of turning into a bit of a crazy nest of nodes here. It helps to keep things sort of as organized as you can. One of the things I want to talk about is what happens if we try to use a different material other than this principled BSDF material. Okay, so to do this, I'm going to create a new material instead of changing this one. So we're going to actually rename this to rock. And if we drag this open, just give us some more space here, you can see that there's plus and minus button on the right side. So to remove a material from our polygonal object, we can click minus and it's removed it. If we want to add an existing material, sort of like this default material here, or a new one, again, I'm going to have to remove this because I just added it. We can click on new, and you can actually add multiple materials. So by clicking plus, you're actually adding a slot for a material, and so you can actually add an existing or create a new one. And so we could add a second one here. And the way that these actually show up on your object is not going to necessarily work the way you think it will. Unless there's alpha transparency on this top one, you're never going to see this bottom one. The other thing that you could also do is just assign specific faces. So we can actually assign these faces to use material 1 by clicking the assign button, and then material 2, we could actually invert our selection, and we could actually assign material 2 to just these selected faces. Right now, you're not seeing any difference. We can actually change that slot to rock, and then if we preview it, you'll see quite a dramatic difference on these faces here. So we're not getting any of these textures to influence these faces here. So you wouldn't really want to do it this way. We can go ahead and just remove that, and we can remove this one as well. Let's create, or let's just assign the second one. We're going to call this emission, or we'll call it light. We're going to use this sphere to create a light. And so to do that, we're going to change this from a principled BSDF to an emission. And so if we zoom in here on our material output, you can see that our principled has been replaced by emission, and we can choose a color here, and we can increase the strength. Right now you're not seeing much happening because there's nothing else in the scene, but if we do Shift A, we're going to add maybe a plane, scale that up, and just move that down. So this plane's actually white. It's using the default white material. Just to prove that, I'm going to add our default material here to our material settings. And just jumping back here to our emission, you can see that it's actually emitting blue light from the object, essentially in every direction. It's acting like a light bulb right now. And so if we bring this down to 0, it's black, not emitting any light. And we're actually contaminating our light with our world settings. So let's go back to the background, plug that in, and disconnect that. And now we're getting our default background color. So let's just go ahead and increase the strength again on our emission, and you should start to see a more clear example of how this is lighting. Okay, so we can kind of change color and strength. We can also recombine materials together to do different things. So I'll just show you an example. We're going to use a diffuse shader and the emission shader and alternate different spots on our object to show different materials. So we're going to do Shift A, and then if we go down to shader, we actually can see all of the shaders available to us by default in Blender. If we go to diffuse BSDF, we can use this with a Shift A, S, and then type mix, and we can use a mix shader to combine these together. Right now they're getting mixed evenly, and so they're sort of kind of watering each material down. So if we go to factor of 0, it's going to be on emission. Factor of 1, it's that diffuse shader. Let's turn our light back on. And so we can't really see the diffuse very well without our light, because emission, while it creates its own light, diffuse needs light in the scene. So if we want to alternate between the two, we can use our factor to do that. We just have to tell the factor what regions of our geometry to do that with. So if we were just to add, let's just type texture here, we could do something like a checker texture. And if we plug that into factor, and it's basically alternating black and gray. Let's just change that to, sorry, white and gray. Now it's white and black. And so now it will do 100% of this color or this shader and 100% of this shader in these different areas. So you could have a texture using a UV coordinate or a UV layout to get finer control over this. Or we can use what's called a procedurally generated texture. So this is procedurally generated by Blender. This isn't a static image. So we can increase it real time here with scale. All right, do something like that. That actually looks like the material icon. And so that's kind of how you can do something interesting, like switch between different shaders on the same object. If we maybe just deleted that and added something like a noise texture. So I'm going to type texture here, go down to noise. And this is a really common texture to use procedurally to sort of generate variation. Let's maybe increase the scale. Okay. And one of the things to note, if we just plug this into the surface, this is what it looks like. It's not very contrasty, so we can add a contrast node, brightness contrast, and just really crank up the contrast here. And if we plug that back into the factor and then reconnect our shader to the surface, like so, now we're getting a more clear delineation between these two shaders. Okay, so that's kind of a really simple way to recombine shaders together. The factor acts like an alpha channel or an opacity map that you might use in Photoshop. Okay, and we can do something interesting like this with our rock material if we wanted. So for instance, we could, let's just add an emission here. We're going to maybe just recombine these together with a mixed shader node, and I'm going to drop that in between, and we're just going to link up our emission into one of the channels here with our mixed shader along with the principled, and we can actually, I don't know, let's try driving the ambient occlusion into the factor of our mixed shader. Okay, so let's bring that from here to here. So right now it's not having that much impact because we have to kind of adjust this a little bit. So let's increase the strength, and I think the ambient occlusion needs to maybe be inverted so that it's happening less. So if I do Shift A S for search and type invert, we can actually just switch those colors. And we might want to increase the contrast as well. So let's do Shift A S, type color ramp. And so color ramp is going to essentially take all of our black and white values and or all of the color values and map them to black and white, and we can control them with the gradient. Now we're actually I put this in the wrong spot, didn't I? We want to put that here and actually put our color ramp on the factor coming from our ambient occlusion. Let's try that again. Okay, so if I increase this here and bring this one up, now what we're getting is a little bit of emission coming out of these spots. And just to show you that this is doing something interesting. Okay, let's get rid of the invert. That was a mistake. There we go. That's what I was trying to do. All right, so I had the invert coming here on the emission connection, which is, you know, not what I was trying to do. So we can make some kind of interesting lava-looking, you know, material just by changing the way the ambient occlusion is actually applied, and we can kind of control the amount of it through this slider. So this is acting like a contrast slider for our ambient occlusion. And if you forget, our ambient occlusion actually looks like this as a texture. It's just a little bit of black and white here and there just to get a little bit more shadow in the crevices. But in this case, we're actually saying that color information is contributing to, you know, this kind of emission, which is, you know, a light. And so we can increase the strength. And so we'll essentially act sort of like a light bulb here. So we're using cycles, so that's going to give us a much better result than Eevee. And I think we can actually give it a little bit more presence here, maybe a little less than that. And we can change the color, maybe more red orange or something. And so that looks interesting. And you know, we could do something even more interesting with color if we want. Okay, so we can go ahead and add a color ramp to plug into here, and we can add a gradient if we want. So gradient, and instead of black and white, we can actually just recolor this to be going between these two colors. Now we're not going to see really anything happening because we haven't told this about the vector information. So if we just kind of plug our UV here in, I think we can try to get a variation happening in the color itself. We can just try a couple different settings and see what we get. It's kind of interesting. We can, you know, adjust the position here. We can also use different vector information. So we could do something like the normal value from our texture coordinate node. We can plug that into vector. Right, so it's using one color over here and one over there. We can do generated, see what that gives us. And I'm actually going to pull this node right over here so that I can stop jumping back and forth quite as much. And actually reflection is kind of nice. So this is giving us some Fresnel reflection or something, some reflective effect happening. Let's see if we can make that a little more subtle. So this is just controlling the type of gradient that we're using here. Okay, actually I think linear was probably our best option. So you know, you can kind of control where color gets applied by using different vectors and different nodes that can create color information. So if I was just to plug this directly into our material output, I'm just going to put that right next to it. So we just went right into the surface. This is actually what that gradient looks like without going through these other channels and these other nodes. So let me just pull that back. I'm just going to undo that by connecting this up to surface. And okay, so that's kind of interesting. We can, you know, like I said before, adjust the amount that this is applied by changing up this factor here. And this is something that can be animated. So you can sort of animate lava, you know, overtaking an object or something. I don't know if this is super convincing lava. That's actually not half bad. And, you know, I didn't do all that much work to be able to achieve a look like this. So, that's kind of one of the advantages of using image maps like these. You can really reuse them in different, interesting, creative ways to get kind of a fun result here. Okay, so in addition to being able to use texture maps to recombine and mix them with different types of shaders, we can, let me just remove that here. We can also look at some other things that we can do. So if we just create a new material, I can just kind of go down and show you what they do. So diffuse is similar to a principled, except without all of the controllability. So we can't really use a PBR workflow, a physically based rendering workflow, without all of those other settings. But if you just need a simple surface that just has a little bit of reflection, and so the roughness channel will work the same way as on the principled. So really rough is a matte surface. Zero roughness is very shiny and reflective. We have color, and then we can use our normal maps the way that we did previously to create those bumps. We can also use glass, and so glass just takes light and just refracts it. So this is like a solid glass orb. We could make it a thin glass shell by adding a solidify modifier and changing the thickness to be a little bit thicker. And now it's as if there was a sort of a piece of glass that was hollow on the interior. Okay, and the color here is blue, so we can actually just kind of take that color back out of it. You can change the index of refraction, so different materials have different indexes of refraction. There's actually a list online of all materials index of refraction, and that's just the way that it bends light as light bounces through the material. Okay, and we can make this frosty by increasing the roughness, and now it's sort of frosted glass. This takes much longer to calculate. Typically, it has to do more light bounces to get this this refracting happening. Let's just keep going here and seeing what else we have. So we can look at subsurface scattering. So this is how skin is simulated. So you can see here that there's sort of light bouncing through the inside. And if we were to maybe increase the proximity of our light here just to put it really close, you can see that the front part here is getting a direct reflection of light, and so you can't see through it as much. And this is like skin or wax, where you can actually see the light bouncing inside the material in an interesting way. So if you hold your hand up to a bright light or your earlobe or something, you'll kind of see the light come through your skin just like this. Okay, and the principled material actually has that setting as well. So if we go back to principled, you can see here that if we just enable subsurface to 1, now we're getting that subsurface scattering of light happening. Okay, so it's usually on or off. You can also make this object metallic by doing 1, and now the way that it reflects light is going to be slightly different than it would before, but in a way that it has properties of a metal object. Metal objects or metal materials have all sorts of different settings. I actually like to use an add-on so I don't have to figure out what those are all the time. You can get that add-on by going to 3d-wolf.com, products, materials. So they make a bunch of different types of things, but one free add-on is called PBR materials. And if we go down to download, we can actually get that material as a zip file. And if we go back to Blender, if you go to Edit, Preferences, under the Add-ons tab, you can click on Install, and you can then just drag and drop that zip file here and click Install Add-on. I'm not going to do that because I've already installed it, but essentially when you search for PBR here in the list, it will show up, and then just make sure that's checked, and it will enable your add-on. Once that's enabled, you can go down to Materials, and there's a new area called PBR Materials. Check that on, and then if you click on the the icon here, it'll show you different default material settings that come with it. The other thing to look at is there's also materials for metal. So dielectric are essentially materials that are not metal, and then everything else is a metal. So we can click on gold, for instance, and you can see it's going to configure our principled BSDF with settings that are most like gold. And we can go back here and click on something like wax. You can see that subsurface is being used here for wax, getting like a really nice subsurface scattering here. And this is obviously a purple wax. You can use different color to get different color candles. So we want a green candle, you just make that green, and you can sort of change the different kind of base color. So the base color is going to be that reflected color, and then the subsurface color is going to be the color of light that gets scattered beneath. So we can make this a lighter color. You can actually change the color to make that different, which can have really interesting effects. Make that a little brighter. Okay, subsurface radius, we can maybe choose a color more similar to this one, and we're getting sort of that more intense purple color here. So this is a fun one. We can come back here and choose rubber, and you can see that it looks very different. It's not a metal, it's not subsurface, but it does have higher roughness settings here. And we can just take a look at a couple. Car paint, that will have a clear coat applied usually, which is like an additional reflection that gets coated over top of your base reflections. And something like a liquid, like blood. I'm not sure why that is looking like this. It should be more red. So interesting. I'm not sure what's going on there. So that one might be a bug. We can look at something like paper. And these come with their own nodes here. So if you actually go into, if you click on this icon, you can see how they're generating this material, which is just a complicated network of nodes. What's nice is we didn't have to create this. We just clicked on a button and it did it for us. So I'm going to just click the up arrow over here to get out of that. So when you want to do realistic materials, make sure that you're using either this add-on or those texture packs that you can download, and you'll get the best results possible. And then also make sure you only have one material applied here at a time, unless you kind of know what you're doing and really know how to work with multiple materials applied to your same object. Again, you can add channels or remove them with the add or the plus or minus button here, and you can select a channel and change the material through this list here. Okay, I think I'm going to just delete that plane, and let's go back to layout view, go to render, jump into our render camera. Try that again. Let's lock our render camera down. And we'll do one final render here.